The Rifle Brigade was an infantry rifle regiment of the British Army, formed in January 1800 as the experimental Corps of Riflemen to provide sharpshooters, scouts and skirmishers. They were soon renamed the Rifle Corps. In January 1803 they became an established regular regiment and were titled the 95th Regiment of Foot. In 1816, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, they were again renamed, this time as the Rifle Brigade. The unit was distinguished by its use of green uniforms as standard in place of the traditional red coat, as well as being armed with the first British-made rifle accepted by the British Army, in place of smoothbore muskets, the first regular infantry corps in the British Army to be so, after distinguished service in both the First and the Second World Wars. The regiment was amalgamated with the 1st Green Jackets and the King's Royal Rifle Corps to form the Royal Green Jackets on 1 January 1966. History. Formation in 1800, an experimental Corps of Riflemen was raised by Colonel Coote Manningham and Lieutenant Colonel Hon. William Stewart, drawn from officers and other ranks from drafts of a variety of British regiments. The Corps differed in several regards from the line infantry of the British Army and most significantly were armed with the formidable Baker rifle. The rifle was remarkably accurate in an era when it was generally considered impractical for individual soldiers to aim at specific targets. Riflemen wore dark green jackets rather than the bright red coats of the British line infantry regiments of that time, close-fitting pantaloons rather than breeches, black facings and black belts rather than white, and a green plume on their stovepipe shakos. As the Rifle Corps 4 months after its formation, the Rifle Corps was judged ready for its first operation. On the 25th of August 1800, 3 companies, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel William Stewart, spearheaded the British amphibious landing at Ferrol, Spain, where the rifles helped to dislodge the Spanish defenders on the heights. Despite this, the expedition was defeated and withdrew on the 26th of August 1800. In April 1801, one company of the Experimental Corps of Riflemen, under the command of Captain Sidney Beckworth, took part in the British victory at the Battle of Copenhagen, as marksmen aboard Royal Navy ships that were under the overall command of Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson. During the battle, the Rifle Corps suffered 1 lieutenant killed, its first officer to fall, and 2 other ranks killed and 6 wounded, some of whom died later. As the 95th Regiment in 1802, the Rifle Corps was brought into the line of the British Army as the 95th Regiment of Foot. In 1803, the 95th moved to Shorncliffe Army Camp, Kent, where it underwent light infantry training, along with the 43rd and 52nd Regiments of Foot, under the tutelage of Colonel Coote Manningham and Sir John Moore. The latter, like the 95th, would gain fame during the Peninsular War. In 1805, a 2nd Battalion was raised at Canterbury, Kent, and later in the year the 1st 95th deployed to Germany as part of a British expedition, under the command of Lord Cathcart, designed to liberate Hanover from occupation by France. The 95th subsequently formed the advance guard on the way to Bremen. In February 1806, the 95th formed the rear guard for the withdrawal to Cuxhaven and subsequently returned home to the UK. South American expedition. In October 1806, 5 companies of the 1st 95th and 3 companies of the 2nd 95th departed for Spanish-controlled South America, Spain then being allied with France. It was part of a second invasion force that was designed as reinforcements for the first invasion against Buenos Aires, launched earlier in 1806 by Sir Hope Popham without the government advance knowledge. The 2nd 95th, as part of Brigadier General Sir Samuel Auchmutte's force, took part in the siege and subsequent storming of Montevideo, in what is now Uruguay, and which saw Montevideo captured on the 3rd of February 1807, after clearing the surrounding area of Spanish troops in January. The 95th subsequently saw action at Colonia against a Spanish force that had crossed from Buenos Aires. The Rifles held off the force until it could be repulsed, with the 95th gaining much praise from Auchmutte for their part in the defeat of the Spanish force. The 95th subsequently saw action in June at San Pedro, where they, the 40th and Light Companies, fought against the Spanish force that had crossed from Buenos Aires and defeated them. Lieutenant General John Whitelock, the newly arrived overall commander, subsequently launched an ill-advised and mismanaged assault on Buenos Aires, in which the companies of both battalions of the 95th were involved as part of the Light Brigade, commanded by Robert Crawford. During the assault on Buenos Aires on the 5th of July, the 95th and the rest of the British force suffered heavy casualties in bitter fighting to capture the city. The Light Brigade had suffered so heavily that they had to take refuge in a church and were surrendered soon after. Whitelock eventually surrendered his force. After Whitelock negotiated the withdrawal of British forces, the men were released and they returned home later that year. The 95th would go on to fight for near the entirety of the Peninsular War in Spain. In the aftermath of the disastrous expedition, Popham and Whitelock were court-martialed, with Popham reprimanded and Whitelock dismissed from the army. The remaining companies of the 95th were involved in the expedition to Denmark that year. They took part in the Battle of Copenhagen in 1807 as part of Arthur Wellesley's brigade. The expedition, commanded by Lord Cathcart, was intended to capture the Danish fleet to prevent it falling into the hands of France. The expedition proved to be a thorough success, with the Danish fleet being captured, at which point the British withdrew. In 1808 the 1st 95th took part in an expedition to another Scandinavian country, Sweden, an expedition that was commanded by Sir John Moore and designed to help Sweden during the war with Russia. However, once they had reached Gothenburg in May, the troops remained aboard the anchored ships for 2 months due to a misunderstanding between the British and Swedish governments and returned to Britain. Peninsular War in August 1808. The 2nd 95th was part of the immediate forces sent in the Portuguese expedition initially commanded by Sir Arthur Wellesley and covered the landings at Montego Bay. On the 15th of August they had the distinction of firing the first shot of the Peninsular War during a skirmish at Obidos against the French, but also unfortunately suffered the first British officer fatality of the war, Lieutenant Ralph Bunbury. The 95th, as part of 6th Brigade, which included the rifle-armed 5th 60th Foot, took part in the Battle of Rolica, the first pitched battle of the war, on the 17th of August 1808. Rifleman Thomas Plunkett of the 1st Battalion, 95th Rifles, shot the French General Auguste François-Marie de Colbert-Chabannes at a range of up to 800 yards at the Battle of Cacabelos on the 3rd of January 1809. The 1st Battalion was part of John Moore's campaign, which ended with evacuation after defeating the French at the Battle of Corunna on the 16th of January, 1809. The majority of the 1st Battalion was rested and refitted in the UK, though a few small detachments of the 95th were stranded behind, which then formed up with other detachments as part of a defence force in Portugal. The first returned to the peninsula a few months later in May 1809, and in July was forced-marched in an attempt to arrive with the main force for the Battle of Talavera, but despite covering a notable distance they arrived on the 29th of July 1809. Just after the battle, after the depletion suffered at Corunna, the two battalions of the 95th based at Hythe in Kent were made up to a strength of 1,000 men each. However, so many volunteers came forward to join the regiment that permission was granted to raise a third battalion in 1809. The regiment had already become so famous and popular that not only were the deficiencies filled up in a very short time, but more than 1,000 volunteers presented themselves beyond the numbers required. It was therefore resolved by the authorities to add a third battalion to the regiment. Sir William Cope, the 3rd Battalion, joined the Peninsular Army in 1810. Thereafter the 3 battalions of the 95th fought in numerous major battles and skirmishes during the Peninsular War as part of the elite light division, including the Battle of Busaco in September 1810 and the sieges of Ciudad Rodrigo in January 1812 and Badajoz in March 1812, as well as the Battle of Vitoria in June 1813. At the Battle of San Marcial in August 1813, a company of the 95th Rifles under the command of Captain Daniel Cadeau held off an entire French division at Vera before withdrawing. The regiment also took part in the Battle of Nivelles in November 1813. Waterloo Campaign. The 3 battalions had been dispersed to various locations with the abdication of Napoleon and the total French defeat in 1814. The majority of the regiment's companies were sent back to England for rest and refitting, while several companies had been retained in northeast France at Lausanne under General Thomas Graham. 5 companies of the 3rd Battalion were in North America, having been sent in late 1814 to participate in the final stages of the War of 1812. With the return of Napoleon from exile, all of the companies in England crossed the Channel and landed in Belgium in May 1815, joining with those already present, so that the entire regiment, bar the 5 companies still in America, became part of Wellington's Anglo-Dutch army. The 1st Battalion went on to fight at the Battle of Quatre Bras on the 16th of June 1815, while all 3 battalions would fight at the Battle of Waterloo on the 18th of June 1815, as the Rifle Brigade at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The size of the British Army was reduced, in line with precedent. The more recently formed regiments were disbanded first. The unique skills of the 95th were considered too valuable to lose, so the 95th, having seen distinguished service in the Napoleonic Wars, was taken out of line of the British Army and became the Rifle Brigade. On the 23rd of February 1816, Regiment of Foot. The Duke of Wellington became Colonel-in-Chief of the regiment in 1820 and served until his death. Later 19th-century campaigns. In 1852, HRH Prince Albert the Prince Consort took over the role of Colonel-in-Chief. When the Crimean War broke out in 1853, the Rifle Brigade sent 2 battalions which fought at the Battle of Alma, where one of the battalions led the advance across the Alma River in September 1854. The regiment also saw action at the Battle of Inkerman in November 1854 and at the Siege of Sevastopol in winter 1854. The regiment won 8 Victoria Crosses during the Crimean War. The regiment was deployed again as part of the Indian Rebellion and saw action at the Siege of Lucknow in autumn 1857. It was granted the title the Prince Consort's own Rifle Brigade, in honor of its colonel-in-chief in 1862. In 1866, Private Timothy O'Hay of the 1st Battalion was awarded the Victoria Cross for an act of bravery in peacetime, while his unit was stationed in Canada. On the 9th of June 1866, at Danville, Quebec, on the main railway between Montreal and Quebec City, a fire broke out in a car containing 2,000 pounds of ammunition. Despite the extreme danger, O'Hay took charge of extinguishing the fire and saved many lives. The regiment also took part in the Battle of Ali Masjid in November 1878 during the Second Anglo-Afghan War, the Massoud Waziri Expedition in 1881, the Third Anglo-Burmese War in 1885, the Fourth Anglo-Ashanti War in 1895, and the Mahdist War in 1898. The 1st Battalion was deployed to South Africa in 1899 and saw action at the Battle of Colenso in December 1899 and Battle of Valkrans in February 1900, while the 2nd Battalion took part in the Siege of Ladysmith in winter 1899 during the Second Boer War. First World War Regular Army. The 1st Battalion landed at Le Havre as part of the 11th Brigade in the 4th Division in August 1914 for service on the Western Front. The battalion saw action at the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914, the First Battle of the Aisne in September 1914 and the Battle of Messines in October 1914, as well as the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, the Battle of the Somme in autumn 1916 and the Battle of Arras in April 1917 before taking part in the Battle of Passchendaele in autumn 1917. The Battle of the Lys in April 1918, the advance in Flanders, the Second Battle of the Somme in August 1918, the battles of the Hindenburg Line and the final advance in Picardy. The 2nd Battalion landed at Le Havre as part of the 25th Brigade in the 8th Division in November 1914 for service on the Western Front. The battalion saw action at the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in March 1915, the Battle of Aubers Ridge in May 1915 and the Battle of the Somme in autumn 1916, as well as the advance to the Hindenburg Line, the Battle of Pilkem Ridge in August 1917 and the Battle of Passchendaele in autumn 1917 before taking part in the Battle of St. Quentin in March 1918. The Battle of Rosiers in March 1918, the Third Battle of the Aisne in May 1918, the Battle of the Scarpa in August 1918 and the final advance in Artois. The 3rd Battalion landed at Saint-Nazaire as part of the 17th Brigade in the 6th Division in September 1914 for service on the Western Front. The battalion saw action at the Battle of Delville Wood in July 1916, the Battle of Guillemont in September 1916 and the Battle of Vimy Ridge in April 1917, as well as the Battle of Messines in June 1917, the Battle of Passchendaele in October 1917 and the Battle of Cambrai in November 1917 before taking part in the Second Battle of the Somme in August 1918, the Battle of Cambrai in October 1918 and the final advance in Picardy. The 4th Battalion landed at Le Havre as part of the 80th Brigade in the 27th Division in December 1914 for service on the Western Front but moved to Salonika in November 1915. Territorial Force. The 18th Battalion, 19th Battalion, 20th Battalion, 21st Battalion, 22nd Battalion, 23rd Battalion and 24th Battalion were all posted overseas on garrison duties in 1916. New armies. The 7th Battalion and 8th Battalion landed at Boulogne-sur-Mer as part of the 41st Brigade in the 14th Division in May 1915 for service service on the Western Front. The 8th Battalion took part in the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915 and the action at Hooge in July 1915, where they saw the first use of flamethrowers by the Germans. 2nd Lieutenant Sidney Woodruff of the 8th Battalion was awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions in this battle. The battalions also saw action in the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915 and an action near Le Briquet in Belgium where Corporal Alfred George Drey, also of the 8th Battalion, was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions on the 23rd of November 1915. The battalions then took part in the Battle of Delville Wood in September 1916, the Battle of Flers-Courcelette in September 1916 and the advance to the Hindenburg Line, as well as the Battle of Arras in April 1917, the Battle of Langemarck in August 1917 and the Battle of Passchendaele in October 1917 before taking part in the Battle of St. Quentin in March 1918, and the Battle of the Havre in April 1918. The 9th Battalion landed at Boulogne-sur-Mer as part of the 42nd Brigade in the 14th Division in May 1915 for service on the Western Front and took part in most of the same battles as the 7th and 8th Battalions. The 10th Battalion and 11th Battalion landed at Boulogne-sur-Mer as part of the 59th Brigade in the 20th Division in July 1915 for service on the Western Front. The battalion saw action at the Battle of Mont-Sorel in June 1916, the Battle of Delville Wood in September 1916 and the Battle of Guillemont in September 1916, as well as the Battle of Flers-Courcelette in September 1916, the Battle of Morville in September 1916 and the Battle of La Transloy in October 1916 before taking part in the advance to the Hindenburg Line, the Battle of Langemarck in August 1917, the Battle of the Menin Road Ridge in September 1917, the Battle of Polygon Wood in September 1917 and the Battle of Cambrai in December 1917. The 12th Battalion landed at Boulogne-sur-Mer as part of the 60th Brigade in the 20th Division in July 1915 for service on the Western Front and took part in most of the same battles as the 10th and 11th Battalions. The 13th Battalion landed at Boulogne-sur-Mer as part of the 111th Brigade in the 37th Division in July 1915 for service on the Western Front. The battalion saw action at the Battle of Loos in September 1915, the Battle of the Somme in autumn 1916 and the advance to the Hindenburg Line, as well as the Battle of Arras in April 1917, the Battle of Passchendaele in autumn 1917 and the Battle of Cambrai in November 1917 before taking part in the Battle of the Lys in April 1918, the Third Battle of the Aisne in May 1918, the Second Battle of the Somme in August 1918, the battles of the Hindenburg Line and the final advance in Picardy. The 16th Battalion landed at Le Havre as part of the 117th Brigade in the 39th Division in March 1916 for service on the Western Front. The battalion saw action at the Battle of the Somme in autumn 1916, the Battle of Pilchem Ridge in August 1917 and the Battle of Langemarck in August 1917, as well as the Battle of the Menin Road Ridge in September 1917, the Battle of Polygon Wood in September 1917 and the Second Battle of Passchendaele in November 1917 before taking part in the Battle of St. Quentin in March 1918 and the Second Battle of Bapaume in August 1918. Interwar. In October 1922 the 2nd Battalion was deployed to Turkey as part of the response to the Chinac crisis, which had followed Turkish efforts to push the Greek armies out of Turkey and restore Turkish rule in the Allied occupied territories of Turkey. primarily in Constantinople. Second World War. The 1st Battalion landed in France as part of the 30th Infantry Brigade in the 1st Armoured Division within the British Expeditionary Force in May 1940, but was lost at the defence of Calais, where the brigade slowed the German advance and enabled the Dunkirk evacuation to proceed. The 1st Battalion was reformed in the United Kingdom and as part of the 22nd Armoured Brigade in the 7th Armoured Division took part in many battles. In the North African Campaign, the 1st Battalion's 4 6-pounders were credited with destroying many tanks from the 21st Panzer Division at the Battle of Alam el Hafa on 31 August 1942. The 1st Battalion took part in the Normandy landings in June 1944 and went on to fight in the Northwest Europe Campaign. The 2nd Battalion, Rifle Brigade, fought with distinction as part of the 7th Motor Brigade in the 1st Armoured Division in the Western Desert Campaign, especially in the snipe action during the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, when the 4 6-pounders of that battalion, supported by a 6-pounder anti-tank battery of the Royal Artillery, knocked out over 50 German and Italian tanks in a lengthy battle. Lieutenant Colonel Victor Bulletona received the Victoria Cross for his actions fighting with the guns. In September 1943, the battalion transferred to the 7th Armoured Brigade in the 10th Armoured Division, remaining with that formation in North Africa until May 1944, when it transferred to the 61st Infantry Brigade in the 6th Armoured Division for service in the Italian campaign. The 7th Battalion was formed by redesignation of 1st Battalion, the London Rifle Brigade, in January 1941. The 8th Battalion took part in the Normandy landings in June 1944, as part of the 29th Armoured Brigade in the 11th Armoured Division, and saw action in the Northwest Europe Campaign. The 9th Battalion served with 4th Armoured Brigade in the 7th Armoured Division and took part in the Battle of Gazala in May 1942 during the North African Campaign, before being disbanded in August 1942. Post-Second World War. From spring 1946, a number of surplus Rifle Brigade subalterns were transferred to No. 1T Force, a British Army unit which was active in the Ruhr. The role was to carry out reparations work, evacuating military and industrial equipment needed to rebuild British industry. The 1st Battalion went on to serve in the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya in 1954 and the Malayan emergency in 1956. Amalgamations. The 1st Battalion was renamed the 3rd Green Jackets, the Rifle Brigade, in 1958 and was amalgamated with the 1st Green Jackets and the King's Royal Rifle Corps to form the Royal Green Jackets on 1 January 1966. Battle Honours. The regiment was awarded the following battle honours: Copenhagen, Montevideo, Rolica, Vimera, Corona, Basico, Barossa, Fuentes Donna, Ciudad Rodrigo, Badajoz, Salamanca, Vitoria, Pyrenees, Nivelle, Nive, Orths, Toulouse, Peninsula, Waterloo, South Africa 1846–47, South Africa 3 February 1851, Alma, Inkerman, Sevastopol, Lucknow, Ashanti 1873–74, Ali Masjid, Afghanistan 1878–79, Burma 1885–87, Khartoum, Defensive Lady Smith, Relief of Lady Smith, South Africa 1899–1902. The Great War. Locato. Retreat from Mons, Mon 1914, Ain 1914, 18, Armentières 1914, Neuve Chapelle, Ypres 1915, 17, Gravenstaffel Street, Julian, Fresenberg, Bellaward, Obers, Hooge 1915, Somme 1916, 18, Albert 1916, 18, Basington, Delville Wood, Guillemont, Fleurs Corslet, Morval, Le Transloy, Ancre Heights, Ancre 1916, 18, Arras 1917, 18, Vimy 1917, Scarpa 1917, 18, Arluse Messine 1917, Pilkham, Longy Mark 1917, Menin Road, Polygon Wood, Broadside, Poel Capel, Passchendaele, Cambrai 1917, 18, Street, Quinton, Rosiers, Havre, Villers-Bretonneux, Lys, Hazebrouck, Bethune, Drocourt Queant, Hindenburg Line, Havrincourt, Canal du Nord, Celle, Valenciennes, Samba, France and Flanders 1914–18, Macedonia 1915–18. The Second World War.